Hello, I'm Jonathan Smith, and today we're going to go over part 2 of Prestolite alternator training. 3 components that make up the charging system: alternator, including the regulator, batteries, and cabling. The charging system and the electrical system are 2 different systems. Basic facts for diagnosing charging issues. Both are the most misunderstood and misdiagnosed systems on the vehicle. There are huge complexities to go between the charging system, the vehicle system, the accessories, and the cabling. How these systems interact affect the performance of both systems. The alternator is not a battery charger. It's a battery maintainer. If you have your vehicle and you left the lights on overnight and the battery is discharged, the alternator is not a good battery charger. It will charge the batteries, but if you start that vehicle up and the batteries are low and then you start turning on all your other systems, that alternator not only has to take care of all the systems on the vehicle, it also has to charge batteries that are low or dead. That is detrimental to the alternator because it has to do 2 jobs now. So ideally, if you have dead batteries, you want to charge those batteries before you take off with the vehicle. I know that's not ideal. That's not how things always work, but you want to kind of have that in the back of your mind if you have dead batteries, that the alternator is not the best charger for that. The alternator is designed to charge the batteries from when the vehicle starts, the current that comes out of the batteries to start the vehicle, and then once that happens, the alternator is maintaining the batteries as it soaks up all the other loads on the vehicle. This slide basically shows how a battery discharges, and then once it charges, where the ions go, how it gets from charged to discharged, back to charged. What I will tell you is the more you cycle a battery, the more life you take out of a battery. So again, we go back to you have a dead set of batteries. You put the alternator on, the alternator recharges the batteries, but then whatever reason, whether you don't have a big enough alternator or you continually leave the lights on, and you cycle that battery where it goes from completely charged back to dead, back to completely charged, the more you cycle that battery, more life you take out of that battery. The battery's main purpose is to crank the engine. Batteries are an electrical storage unit. So that's stored power up. So when you go to the truck and you start the vehicle, that power comes from the battery, starts the vehicle. Once that happens, the alternator should have enough capacity to maintain the system without taking power out of the battery. You may have instances where you need more power in the system than the alternator can produce, but those should be short term, like a lift gate, grid heaters on an engine, where those come on intermittently for a short period of time and draw more current. By and large, the alternator is maintaining the system and the battery is not cycling, meaning it's not going dead and then the alternator has to charge it back up. It's important to know that discharged batteries can absorb up to 20% of the battery's cold cranking amp rating. So a 600 amp cold cranking amp rating, 20% of that's 120 amps. So that battery can potentially ask the system for an extra 120 amps that the alternator is not rated for. So now the alternator not only has its vehicle load, but the battery is asking for an extra 120 amps. That's going to be detrimental to the alternator and detrimental to the batteries because the batteries are going to cycle more. The other thing you want to understand is the battery's state of health. So if you have a shorted cell in your battery, that can draw a tremendous amount of current from the batteries that's going to ask the alternator for that the alternator can't produce. So again, you're asking the alternator to do things it's not supposed to do. You're asking it for extra amperage. So you want on a regular basis, check your batteries, make sure that they are able to maintain a state of charge, make sure they don't have any short cells, all those kind of things so the system has good batteries to work with. Additional effects on the system. Sulfated is caused by undercharging for extended period of time or sitting in a discharged state. This affects our high amperage demand and may not receive or hold a state of charge. The other thing you have to understand is as a battery discharges, it leaves a certain chemical residue on top of the battery. As dirt and grime and grease and road dust all get on top of that battery and they sit there, you can actually, that will discharge your battery as well. You can put your meter on the positive and drag the other side of your meter across the top of the battery. If you see battery voltage like that, that means your battery is discharging because it's dirty. The other thing that can happen is shedding is caused by vibration or elevated electrolytic temperatures, which may cause premature failure. So a battery's worst enemy is heat, vibration, and low charging current or voltage. Cabling is very critical and often overlooked. Proper cabling, correctly sized for the maximum output of the alternator, evenly transferred power over positive and negative cables to properly maintain charging and electrical systems and components. So improper cabling, if you have too small a cabling, you're going to get high resistance, which is going to equal high heat. Overheating of rectifier diodes, positive and negative, and improper voltage delivered to the components, including the battery. So you have a low charged battery in a low state of charge, and then you're going to have the components on your vehicle. So say you have a 12-volt system, components on your vehicle are designed to operate in that 12-volt system. So if the vehicle's got a lower state of charge for the battery, that means all those components are running on less than optimal voltage, whether it's 11 volt, 12 and a half, 11 volts, whatever those things are. If you have electrical components that aren't running on the voltage they're designed to run on, that's detrimental for those components. A lot of times when I'm diagnosing a starter issue, the first thing I look at is, does the alternator big enough to make sure the batteries are charged so that the starter is doing starts at the right voltage? Low crank, slow crank speed. If you're having that continually day to day on a regular basis, that's detrimental to your starter, and that's also detrimental to the electrical components on the vehicle. Heat resistance due to loose connections can be found at the battery terminals. Make sure they're properly tightened. Starter terminals, alternator terminals. Corrosion inside the cable. A lot of times you'll look at one end of the cable or the other and everything looks good. It looks a nice copper color, but there's resistance in that line. A lot of times moisture can draw in and it can go in the cable and you'll have a green section in the cable that you can't see. So that's why it's very important not only to do a visual inspection, but you want to do a voltage drop on your positive line and your negative line to make sure your cabling is in a good state of health. You can also have the cable insulation. If it rubs away, if it's rubbing on something, you can get a dead short. That's going to cause more current to be required in the system. And any other electrical component connections are going to be detrimental to your ability to charge the battery and the battery's discharging. So how much voltage drop is too much? We recommend no more than a half a volt on the positive side and the negative side. So no more than a quarter of a volt on each side. So your total drop is no more than a half a volt. And again, that's why it's important, because remote sense can sometimes mask these voltage drops. So what are the effects? You're going to have excessive resistance, so more excessive heat, progressive alternator failures, because now the alternator's got to work harder to overcome that drop, progressive battery failure because it's harder to charge those batteries because you have a voltage drop, and progressive starter failure, because if the alternator hasn't kept the batteries charged enough and then your starter has low voltage start, slow crank, you're going to have progressive starter failure. Cable sizing. I'm not going to read all this for you, but basically what I want you to understand is if you have a vehicle, if you have a truck and it has a 160 amp alternator on it, and then you add components, so you add an inverter, you add a battery HVAC system, whatever that is, that requires you to go from a 160 amp alternator to say a 350 amp alternator, you want to make sure that you adjust the cabling, you increase the cable size to compensate for that extra amperage requirement. Because if you don't, you've put on a bigger alternator, you've put on all these components, but if you don't upgrade the cabling, you're not going to get the performance out of that alternator, that HVAC system, or that inverter that you want, because the cable isn't big enough to conduct that current. The other thing you want to make sure is if you move the battery box. So the battery box was up front toward the front of the tractor, and for whatever reason, whatever custom upfit, that battery box moves back. You want to make sure that when it moves back, you have the right size cable to conduct that current farther. So cabling size depends on alternator size and how far the cables have to go. This diagram is just going to show correct cabling versus incorrect cabling. It's most apparent in the 4 battery set, because if you have a in and out of the positive and negative coming out of one battery, that battery is getting cycled the most, and then the other batteries get cycled less and less. Usually when people change batteries, they change all 4. So you're changing all 4 batteries based on the life of the one that's cycled up and down the most. If you go to the proper cabling, positive out the one side, negative out the other, you're utilizing all 4 batteries equally, so you get more life out of all the batteries. They charge better, they discharge better, and they have better life. Thanks for tuning in today. Please stay tuned for more technical videos from Prestolite Leece-Neville.